My world was one of absolutes, governed by a single, sacred creed first: do no harm. As a trauma surgeon at Hong Kong General, I was a god in a sterile kingdom of steel and antiseptic, imposing order on the chaos of the human body. My life was a study in clean lines, precise incisions, and the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. It was a world that made sense, until the night it didn't. He arrived not in an ambulance, but like a king being carried from a battlefield, flanked by silent, black-suited soldiers who moved with predatory grace. The man on the stretcher was a ghost, his life bleeding out from a catastrophic gunshot wound. His name was a lie, his history a void. But his eyes, when they flickered open, were a stormy, gray-green sea of fierce, indomitable will. They were the most beautiful and terrifying things I had ever seen. They gave me no choice. In a trauma bay that became my operating room, with his men as my nurses, I was forced into a Hippocratic heresy. For 2 hours, I worked against the clock, my hands moving with a desperate, focused precision, and I pulled him back from the brink. I saved the devil's life, and in doing so, I believed my ordeal was over. For a week, I tried to wash the memory of his blood from my hands, to forget the chilling intensity of his gaze. I tried to return to my quiet, orderly life. But men like him do not simply disappear. They haunt you. The knock on my apartment door was soft, polite, and utterly final. It was his men, their faces impassive masks. My abduction was as silent and efficient as his surgery. A helicopter ride through a sky the color of bruises delivered me to a new reality, a breathtaking penthouse suite atop a glittering casino in Macau. It was a gilded cage, a masterpiece of cold, impersonal luxury. He was waiting for me, standing before a panoramic window that overlooked the city he owned. He was no longer a ghost, but a creature of pure, vibrant, and terrifying power. The right side of his face was hidden behind a sleek, black mask, a chilling statement of his otherness. He turned, his stormy eyes holding a cold, possessive amusement. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, melodic thing that sent a shiver down my spine. "Welcome to your new home." He explained my new reality with a chilling simplicity. I was his personal physician, my life, my skills, my oath, they all belonged to him now. The brilliant surgeon who had saved his life was now just another one of his beautiful, priceless possessions. Part 1. The Hippocratic Heresy. The Hippocratic Oath is not a suggestion. It is a creed, a sacred text written in the universal language of blood and bone. First, do no harm. It was the principle upon which I had built my life, a clean, sterile, and absolute moral framework in a world that was messy and gray. I was Dr. Evelyn Reed, and in the controlled, high-stakes theater of the operating room, I was a god. My hands, steady and sure, could mend the torn fabric of a human life, could cheat death, could impose order on the chaos of a broken body. My world was one of clean lines, of precise incisions, of the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. It was a world that made sense, until the night it didn't. The emergency room of Hong Kong General was a special kind of hell on a Saturday night. It was a chaotic, cacophonous symphony of human suffering, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood, the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic, and the low, keening hum of pain. I was on hour 30 of a 36-hour shift, my body a numb, caffeine-fueled machine, my mind a sharp, focused scalpel, cutting through the noise, the chaos, the exhaustion. A multiple vehicle pileup on the Kowloon-Canton Railway had turned the ER into a war zone. I was moving from one trauma bay to another, a blur of blue scrubs and focused intensity. My hands working with a speed and a precision that was born of years of brutal, relentless training. I was in my element. I was in control. And then, he arrived. He did not come in an ambulance. Its sirens a screaming, desperate plea for help. He was brought in through a private entrance, a silent, efficient procession of dark, expensive sedans that had somehow bypassed the hospital's stringent security protocols. He was carried in on a stretcher by two men who were not paramedics. They were large, silent, and impeccably dressed, their faces hard, emotionless masks, their movements the fluid, economical motions of soldiers. They were followed by a third man, an older, distinguished-looking Chinese man with the cold, intelligent eyes of a scholar and the still, dangerous presence of a predator. He was the one who spoke. "We need a doctor," he said, his English perfect, his voice a low, calm, and utterly commanding thing that cut through the chaos of the ER like a scalpel through flesh. Dr. Chen, the head of the ER, a man whose unflappable calm was the stuff of hospital legend, looked at the procession, his face a mask of a new, unfamiliar emotion fear. "This is a hospital," he said, his voice a tight, strained thing. "You will wait your turn." The older man simply looked at him, his gaze holding a silent, chilling weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Dr. Chen's bluster, his authority, his years of command in this chaotic kingdom of life and death, simply evaporated. "This way," he said, his voice a choked, defeated whisper. They were given the main trauma bay, a room that was supposed to be reserved for the most critical, life-threatening cases. The victims of the train crash, the ordinary, anonymous citizens whose lives were hanging in the balance, were pushed aside. I was the best trauma surgeon on duty. I was the one they came for. The man on the stretcher was a ghost. His skin was a pale, waxy, almost translucent white, his lips a bloodless, bluish gray. He was dressed in the tattered, blood-soaked remnants of what had once been an expensive, bespoke suit, a makeshift pressure bandage, a wad of fine silk, was pressed against a gaping, ugly wound in his abdomen, a gunshot wound, a bad one. I moved to his side, my professional instincts taking over, the adrenaline a clean, sharp jolt that cut through my exhaustion. "What's his name?" I asked. My voice the sharp, clear, and authoritative command of the operating room. "His name is not your concern," the older man said, his voice a cold, dismissive thing. I looked up at him, my eyes meeting his across the blood-soaked form of the dying man. His name, his age, his blood type, his medical history. "They are all my concern if you want me to save his life," I retorted. My voice a sharp, clipped thing. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or a grudging. Almost imperceptible respect passed through his cold, intelligent eyes. "His name is Mr. Tanaka," he said. "He is 35. His blood type is O negative. He has no known allergies." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. The name was a placeholder, a ghost. But it was enough. I began my assessment, my hands moving with a swift, practiced efficiency, my mind a cold, clear, and analytical machine. The wound was bad. The bullet had torn through his abdomen, likely shredding his spleen and nicking his aorta. He was bleeding out, his life draining away with every shallow, ragged breath he took. "He needs surgery," I said, my voice a flat. "Final thing. Now, or he will be dead in 10 minutes. Then you will operate." The older man, Mr. Chen, a man I now knew was not a doctor, but a commander, said, "I will operate in my operating room," I said, my voice a hard, unyielding thing, "with my team." "And my equipment?" "No," he said, his voice a soft, silken, and utterly terrifying thing. "You will operate here, with what you have, and your team will be my men. They will assist you." I stared at him, my mind reeling, the full, horrifying reality of the situation finally crashing down on me. This was not a request. It was a command. I was not a doctor, a healer, a god in my own sterile, controlled kingdom. I was a tool, a skilled pair of hands to be used, and then, I suspected, discarded. The Hippocratic Oath, my sacred text, my moral compass, was a fragile, useless thing in the face of the cold, hard reality of the gun I now saw tucked discreetly into the waistband of one of the younger men's suits. First, do no harm. But what was the greater harm to refuse? To let this man die, to uphold my oath at the cost of my own life, and likely the lives of my colleagues, or to submit, to become a heretic, to use my sacred skills to save a man who was. I knew with a cold, gut-deep certainty. A monster, I looked down at the dying man on the stretcher. His face, even in its waxy, death-like pallor, was a masterpiece of cruel, beautiful, and unforgettable angles. He was half Japanese, half Chinese, a stunning, brutal, and utterly captivating mix of two ancient, powerful cultures. He had high, sharp cheekbones, a strong aristocratic jaw, and a mouth that, even in its bloodless, slack state, was a thin, cruel, and sensual line. And then, his eyes flickered open. They were not the dull, unfocused eyes of a man on the brink of death. They were sharp, intelligent, and blazing with a fierce, defiant, and utterly indomitable will to live. They were the color of a stormy sea, a deep, dark, and turbulent gray-green. And they were the most beautiful and terrifying things I had ever seen. He looked at me, his gaze a sharp, piercing thing that seemed to see right through the sterile, professional facade to the terrified, conflicted woman beneath. And in their depths, I saw a silent, desperate, and utterly compelling plea. In that moment, the choice was made. I was a doctor, and this was my patient. The surgery was a brutal, bloody, and miraculous ballet. The trauma bay became my operating room, the harsh, fluorescent lights my surgical lamps, the two silent, black-clad soldiers became my nurses, their movements surprisingly deft and efficient as they followed my sharp, clipped commands. I worked with a speed and a focus that was almost inhuman. I was no longer a terrified, conflicted woman. I was a machine, a finely tuned instrument of healing. I opened him up, my scalpel a clean, precise, and confident line. The damage was as bad as I had feared. His spleen was a shredded, bloody mess. His aorta was nicked. A small, fatal tear that was pumping his life out onto the sterile, white sheets. I worked against the clock, against the steady, relentless drip of the blood bag, against the slow, inexorable march of death. I clamped, I cut, I sutured, my hands moving with a fluid, intuitive grace that was a thing of beauty in the heart of the bloody, Brutal chaos. For 2 hours, the world shrank to the small, illuminated circle of his open body. There was no fear, no morality, no past, no future. There was only the problem, and the solution, the chaos, and the order I was imposing upon it. And then, it was over. I had done it. I had pulled him back from the brink. I had cheated death. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a triumphant, beautiful, and utterly profane symphony. I stepped back from the table, my body a numb, trembling, and utterly exhausted vessel. I was covered in his blood, my blue scrubs a dark, sticky, and horrifying red. The older man, Mr. Chen, who had been a silent, watchful presence in the corner of the room throughout the entire ordeal, stepped forward. He looked down at the stabilized, unconscious form of his master, then at me. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable emotion. "You have done well, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, almost thoughtful murmur. And then, they were gone. They moved with the same silent, efficient, and utterly terrifying speed with which they had arrived. They lifted their master from the stretcher, his body a still, unconscious weight, and they carried him out into the night, leaving behind a room that looked like a slaughterhouse, a team of shell-shocked nurses and doctors, and me, a woman who had just sold her soul to save the devil. The days that followed were a strange, surreal, and deeply unsettling return to normalcy. I tried to put the night of the surgery behind me, to dismiss it as a bizarre, traumatic, and ultimately, a one-off event in a city that was full of them. I scrubbed my hands until they were raw, as if I could wash away the memory of his blood, of his life, that I had held in my hands, but the memory of him, of his beautiful, brutal face, of his fierce, indomitable eyes, was a ghost that haunted my waking hours and my dreams. I was in my apartment, a small, clean, and minimalist space that was my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos of the hospital. It was a week after the surgery. I was sitting by the window, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the city of Hong Kong glitter and pulse with a million points of light. I was trying to feel normal again, to feel safe. The knock on the door was a soft, polite, and utterly terrifying sound. I froze, my heart a cold, hard knot of fear in my chest. It was the same sound, the same quiet, deliberate, and utterly menacing rhythm as the knock on the hospital door a week ago. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply sat there, a prisoner in my own home, and I waited. The lock on my door, a heavy, state-of-the-art deadbolt, clicked open with a soft, almost gentle snick. The door swung open. It was Mr. Chen. He stood in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure, his face a mask of polite, chilling indifference. He was not alone. The two silent, black-clad soldiers were with him. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, calm, and utterly final thing. "Mr. Tanaka requires a follow-up consultation. My world, the clean, sterile, and orderly world I had so carefully constructed, ended in that moment. I did not scream. I did not fight. I simply stood, my teacup slipping from my numb fingers and shattering on the polished hardwood floor, and I allowed them to lead me out into the night. The helicopter was a sleek, black, and utterly silent machine. It was waiting for us on a private helipad on the roof of a nearby skyscraper. The city of Hong Kong spread out beneath us, a glittering, indifferent carpet of diamonds. The flight was a silent, disorienting journey into a new, terrifying world. We flew over the dark, choppy waters of the South China Sea toward a distant, glittering island of light, Macau, the Vegas of the East. A city of casinos, of money, of a glittering, beautiful, and utterly corrupt soul. The helicopter landed on the roof of the tallest, most opulent, and most outrageously beautiful building I had ever seen. It was a soaring, modern masterpiece of glass and steel, designed to look like a mythical azure dragon, its body coiling around a central tower that seemed to pierce the very heavens, the Azure Palace, the flagship of the Tanaka Empire. I was led from the helipad, through a series of private, silent corridors, and into a penthouse suite that was not a room, but a kingdom. It was a vast, two-story space of glass and white marble, decorated with a cold, minimalist, and breathtakingly expensive elegance. The walls were adorned with priceless works of modern art. The furniture was a collection of sleek, architectural masterpieces, a grand piano, a gleaming black beast, stood in the center of the room, and one entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the glittering, corrupt city below. He was standing by the window, his back to me, a dark, imposing figure in a simple, elegant black silk robe. He was no longer the pale, bloodless ghost from the hospital. He was a creature of pure, vibrant, and terrifying power. He turned to face me. His face was as I remembered it, a masterpiece of cruel, beautiful, and unforgettable angles. But it was different. The right side of his face, from his high, sharp cheekbone to his strong, aristocratic jaw, was covered by a sleek, modern, and utterly terrifying black mask. It was not a medical device. It was a part of him, a piece of his armor, a declaration of his otherness. His eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, were as sharp, as intelligent, and as terrifying as I remembered. They held no gratitude, no warmth, only a cold, possessive, and utterly chilling amusement. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, smooth, and melodic thing, a strange, beautiful, and utterly terrifying counterpoint to the violence of his world. "Welcome to your new home. The Devil's Physician, Part 2, The Gilded Cage." The wedding was a spectacle of obscene opulence and soul-crushing coldness. It took place in a grand, ancient Orthodox cathedral on the banks of the Moskva River, a place that smelled of melting beeswax, cold stone, and centuries of secrets. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a cloying, sweet perfume that did nothing to mask the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. I was a ghost at my own wedding, a pale, black-clad American girl adrift in a sea of stern, Slavic faces and glittering, unfamiliar jewels. I was dressed in a severe but exquisitely tailored black dress that Orlov's silent, efficient assistants had provided. My only adornment the simple gold locket my mother had given me for my 16th birthday. It felt like a relic from another life, a fragile, hollow thing against the heavy, suffocating weight of my new reality. The cathedral was filled with the bratva. They were a silent, imposing army of men in dark suits, their faces hard and unreadable, their eyes holding the cold, flat look of predators. Their women were just as intimidating, draped in furs and diamonds, their painted faces masks of cool, assessing indifference. They looked at me not with welcome, but with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. I was an outsider, an anomaly, a soft, foreign thing that had been thrust into their hard, brutal world. And then there was Dmitri. He stood at the altar, a monolith of a man, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his perfectly tailored black suit. He was a creature of shadows and ice, his face a mask of cold, unyielding control. He did not look at me as I walked down the long, echoing aisle on Orloff's arm. He stared straight ahead, at the gilded iconostasis, his expression as remote and unforgiving as a Siberian winter. The ceremony was a blur of ancient, incomprehensible Russian. The priest's voice a low, monotonous chant that echoed in the vast vaulted space. I felt like a sacrificial lamb being led to the slaughter, a voiceless offering in a ritual I did not understand. When the time came for the vows, Dmitri's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the Russian words a cold, binding chain that wrapped around my soul. My own voice, when I was prompted to speak, was a reedy, trembling whisper, the unfamiliar words a bitter, foreign taste on my tongue. He placed a heavy, ornate gold band on my finger. It was cold and impossibly heavy, a manacle that sealed my fate. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes, those chilling, pale blue-gray eyes, held no warmth, no emotion, only a cold, possessive finality. He was not my husband. He was my owner. The reception was held at a lavish, heavily guarded mansion on the outskirts of Moscow. A sprawling, opulent fortress of marble and glass that overlooked a frozen, snow-dusted forest. This, I learned with a sinking, cold dread, was my new home, my new prison. It was a gilded cage, a masterpiece of cold, impersonal luxury. The floors were polished black marble, the walls adorned with modern, abstract art that was as soulless and intimidating as the people who now surrounded me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and the cloying, sweet smell of fear. I moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost, a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking clutched in my numb hand. Men with faces like maps of hard roads would nod at me, their eyes cold and assessing. Women with diamonds dripping from their ears would offer me thin, brittle smiles that did not reach their eyes. I was the new Tsarina, the puppet queen, and they were all watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to show a weakness, to prove that I was the soft, unworthy American they all believed me to be. Dmitri was a constant, silent presence at my side, his hand a heavy, proprietary weight on the small of my back. He was a wall of ice and steel, shielding me from the curious, predatory gazes, but also trapping me in his cold, suffocating orbit. He introduced me to his inner circle, his Sovetniki, a group of hard, older men with the dead eyes of killers. They were the pillars of the Petrova Empire, the men who had been loyal to my father, and who now, I realized, were loyal only to the man who stood beside me. The wedding night was not a night of passion. It was a night of negotiation, a cold, brutal laying down of the law. Dmitri led me to the master suite, a vast cavernous room decorated in shades of black and gray, with a wall of glass that offered a panoramic, moonlit view of the frozen forest. It was a beautiful, desolate, and utterly terrifying room. He did not touch me. He did not even look at me with anything resembling desire. He stood by the window, a dark, imposing silhouette against the stark, white landscape, and he laid out the terms of my imprisonment. "You are my wife," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "You will live in this house. You will want for nothing. You will be protected, but you will be a prisoner. You will not leave this estate without my permission and without an escort. You will not make contact with your old life. You will not question my business. You will not question my authority. You will be a ghost, a name, a symbol. You will be Anya Petrova, the head of this family, in name only. I will be the one who rules." He turned to face me then, his eyes a chilling, pale fire in the dim light. "You are a liability, Anya, a soft, American girl who knows nothing of this world. You are a weakness, and I do not tolerate weakness. Do you understand?" I stood there, my heart a cold, hard knot of fear and a new, unfamiliar emotion, a hot, searing, and profound anger. I had been stripped of my life, my identity, my future. I had been sold, bartered, and shackled to this cold, brutal man. I would not be his puppet. I would not be his ghost. "I understand," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, my chin lifting in a small, almost imperceptible act of defiance. "But you are mistaken about one thing, Dmitri. I am not weak." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or a grudging, almost imperceptible respect passed through his eyes before they turned to ice again. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "We shall see," he said, and then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the vast, cold, and silent cage he had built for me. The days that followed were a study in empty, suffocating luxury. I was a prisoner in a palace, a ghost haunting the long, silent corridors of a house that was not a home. I had a staff of silent, watchful servants who catered to my every need. A wardrobe of designer clothes I had no desire to wear, and a library filled with rare, leather-bound books that offered no comfort. I explored my gilded cage, mapping its boundaries, learning its rhythms. The mansion was a fortress, its walls thick, its windows bulletproof, its grounds patrolled by an army of silent, black-clad guards. There was no escape. Dmitri was a phantom, a creature of the night. He would leave before dawn, a low, powerful growl of his armored car the only sign of his departure. He would return late, long after I had retreated to my own suite of rooms, a separate, isolated wing of the vast mansion. I rarely saw him, but I felt his presence everywhere. It was in the way the staff moved with a hushed, fearful efficiency, in the cold, oppressive silence of the house, in the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. He began my education, as he had so coldly called it. He would leave files on the table in my sitting room, unmarked manila folders filled with the brutal, unvarnished truth of the world I now inhabited. Police reports detailing gruesome, unsolved murders, financial statements that traced a complex, global web of money laundering and extortion, grainy surveillance photos of men with dead eyes exchanging briefcases in dark, anonymous alleyways. He was showing me the blood and the ink that were the foundation of the Petrova Empire. He was showing me the monster he was, the monster my father had been. He expected me to be horrified, to be repulsed, to break. He expected me to retreat into my gilded cage and become the docile, ornamental wife he wanted me to be. I was horrified. I was repulsed, but I did not break. Instead, a strange, cold curiosity began to take root in the ashes of my old life. I began to read the files not with the emotional, visceral horror of a victim, but with the cool, analytical detachment of a historian. I began to see the patterns, the strategies, the brutal, cold logic of this world. I began to understand. My first act of defiance was not a dramatic, futile escape attempt. It was a small, quiet, and, in its own way, far more dangerous act of rebellion. One evening, Dmitri was hosting a dinner for his Sovetniki, his inner circle of advisors. I was expected to be there, a silent, beautiful, and utterly decorative presence at the head of the long, polished dining table. I sat through the endless courses of rich, elaborate food, listening to the low, guttural murmur of Russian, the clink of crystal and silver, the thick, cloying smell of cigar smoke. They spoke of violence and death with a casual, almost bored indifference, as if they were discussing the weather or the price of oil. Dmitri, at the other end of the table, was in his element. He was the Tsar in his court, his authority absolute, his every word a command. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated power. They were discussing a problem with a new smuggling route through the Baltics, a dispute with a rival Lithuanian gang. The conversation was a stalemate, a circular argument of threats and counter-threats. And then, I spoke. "You are approaching it from the wrong direction," I said, my voice a clear, quiet note in the thick, masculine silence. The room went still. A dozen pairs of hard, cold eyes turned to me. I could feel Dimitri's gaze on me, a physical weight, a blast of pure, icy fury. I had broken the most sacred rule. I had spoken. I ignored the fear, the cold, hard knot of it in my stomach, and I continued, my voice gaining a new, unfamiliar strength. "You are thinking like warriors. You should be thinking like historians. The Lithuanians are not a new problem. They have a history with the Petrova family. A history of broken treaties and bad blood that goes back 2 generations. They are not motivated by profit. They are motivated by pride. You cannot buy them. You cannot intimidate them. But you can humiliate them." I laid out a plan, a simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless strategy based not on brute force, but on a deep, historical understanding of our enemy's weaknesses. It was a plan that would not just defeat them, but would dismantle their honor, their pride, the very foundation of their power. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. I looked down the long, polished table at Dmitri. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes unreadable. But I saw it. A flicker. A spark of something in the depths of his frozen gaze. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was a grudging, almost imperceptible, and utterly terrifying respect. That night, he did not leave me to the cold, empty silence of my own wing. He came to my room. He stood in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure, and he watched me for a long, silent moment. "You are a dangerous woman, Anya Petrova," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "I had a good teacher," I retorted, my own voice a cool, steady counterpoint to the wild, frantic beating of my heart. He walked toward me, and the air in the room grew thick, heavy, charged with a new, more potent form of tension. This was not the cold, indifferent jailer. This was something else. This was a man, a predator, who had just seen his prey bare its teeth. He stopped in front of me, so close I could feel the heat of his body, so close I could see the intricate, swirling patterns of the tattoos on his neck. He reached out and cupped my jaw, his hand a rough, calloused cage around my face. "You think you are clever," he murmured, his thumb stroking my bottom lip. A slow, deliberate, and utterly possessive gesture. "You think you can play this game, but you have no idea of the rules. You have no idea of the stakes." He leaned in, his mouth inches from mine, his breath a warm, whiskey-scented caress against my skin. "You are in my world now, Zhena," he whispered. The Russian word for wife, a strange, intimate, and terrifying sound on his tongue, and in my world. The queen does not just advise the king, she belongs to him. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion, it was a kiss of possession, a brutal, punishing, and utterly devastating claiming. And as his mouth plundered mine, as his body pinned me against the cold, hard wall of my gilded cage, I knew that the real war, the one for my body, my heart, my very soul, had just begun. The Devil's Physician, Part 3, The Doctor's Duty. The first week of my imprisonment was a study in luxurious, soul-crushing monotony. I was a bird in a gilded cage, a rare, exotic specimen trapped in a habitat of breathtaking beauty and chilling sterility. The penthouse suite at the Azure Palace was not a home, it was a museum. A perfectly curated exhibition of one man's immense wealth and profound loneliness. My days fell into a rhythm of quiet, suffocating emptiness. I would wake in a bed the size of my old Hong Kong apartment, the sheets 1,000 thread-count silk that felt like a shroud. I would be served exquisite meals I had no appetite for by a silent, ghost-like staff who moved with a fearful, reverent efficiency, their eyes always downcast, their presence a constant, unnerving reminder of the invisible, absolute power that governed this place. I had a library filled with first editions, a state-of-the-art gym I never used, and a grand piano that remained a silent, mocking testament to a life of art and beauty that felt 1,000,000 miles away. And I had the view, the endless, glittering, and utterly indifferent panorama of Macau. A city of 1,000,000 tiny, frantic lives, a world I could see but could not touch. I was a doctor with no patients, a healer with nothing to heal. My hands, the skilled, confident instruments that had once held the power of life and death, were now idle, useless. It was a special kind of torture, a slow, corrosive erosion of my identity, my purpose, of Cato. I saw almost nothing. He was a phantom, a creature of the night who moved through the vast, silent spaces of the penthouse like a ghost. I would sometimes catch a glimpse of him, a dark, imposing figure in a black silk robe, standing by the vast, panoramic window, his masked face turned toward the city he owned. He never spoke to me. He never acknowledged my presence. It was a deliberate, calculated act of psychological warfare, a constant, silent reminder of my utter irrelevance in his world. I was not a person. I was an asset, a tool, a piece of medical equipment to be kept sterile and ready for use. The waiting was the worst part. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, the knowledge that at any moment, the sterile, silent peace of my gilded cage could be shattered by a summons, a command, a test. The test came on a Tuesday. It was a gray, humid afternoon. The sky over Macau a flat, oppressive sheet of white. I was in the library, a thick, leather-bound copy of The Art of War open on my lap. It was a book I had found on Kaido's shelves, a chilling, fascinating glimpse into the mind of my captor. Mr. Chen, Kaido's ever-present, ever-silent major domo, appeared in the doorway. He did not knock. He simply materialized, a dark, immaculate figure of quiet, deadly efficiency. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, calm, and utterly final thing. "Your services are required." My heart, which had been beating in a dull, listless rhythm, gave a hard, painful lurch. The book slipped from my numb fingers and fell to the plush, silent carpet. This was it. The moment I had been dreading. The moment I had been, in a strange, perverse way, waiting for. I followed him, my heels clicking a sharp, staccato rhythm on the polished marble floors. He did not lead me to Kaido's suite. He led me to a part of the penthouse I had not seen before. A stark, windowless, and utterly sterile wing that was a chilling, minimalist echo of the hospital I had left behind. The room he led me into was not an operating room. It was an interrogation room. It was a place of cold, hard, and brutal truth. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and a faint, coppery tang of old blood. In the center of the room was a single, stainless steel chair. A man was strapped to it. He was not a soldier. He was not a hardened killer. He was a small, slight man in a cheap, sweat-stained suit, his face a pale, puffy mask of terror and pain. His clothes were torn, his lips split and bleeding, a dark, ugly bruise blooming on his cheek. Kaido was standing by a stainless steel table, his back to me. He was not in his usual silk robe. He was dressed in a simple, severe black shirt and trousers, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the sterile, white room. He was a creature of darkness in a world of blinding, unforgiving light. He turned to face me. His masked face was a mask of cold, dispassionate curiosity. His eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, held no anger, no cruelty, only a chilling, almost clinical detachment. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, smooth, and melodic thing that was a terrifying counterpoint to the scene in front of me. "Allow me to introduce you to Mr. Liang. He was a business associate. It seems, however, that Mr. Liang has been disloyal. He has been selling information to a rival, a rather messy business." He gestured to the man in the chair. "We have had a conversation. Mr. Liang has been forthcoming. But he is a delicate man, and I have a few more questions for him. Your task, doctor, is to ensure that he remains conversational." I stared at him, my mind reeling, the full, horrifying reality of his request crashing down on me. He did not want me to save this man. He wanted me to repair him, to patch him up, to keep him alive just long enough for the torture to continue. I was not to be a healer. I was to be a mechanic, a technician, a partner in his brutal, bloody work, the Hippocratic Oath. My sacred text, my moral compass, was a fragile, useless thing in the face of this cold, hard, and utterly profane reality. First, do no harm. But what was the greater harm to refuse, to let this man die, to uphold my oath at the cost of my own life, or to submit, to become a heretic, to use my sacred skills not to heal, but to prolong a man's suffering? "No," I said. The word "a" choked, disbelieving whisper. Kaido's eyes, the only part of his face that was visible, narrowed slightly. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or a cold. Cruel amusement passed through his gaze. "No," he repeated, his voice a soft, silken, and utterly terrifying thing. "I am a doctor," I said, my own voice a reedy, trembling thing, but gaining a new, unfamiliar strength with every word. "I took an oath. I save lives. I do not do this. You do what I tell you to do," he said, his voice a flat, unyielding thing. "You are my physician, and this man is your patient. This man is your victim," I retorted, my voice rising, a hysterical, desperate edge creeping into it. "And you are not my patient. You are my captor. You are a monster." He was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He simply looked at me, his gaze a sharp, piercing thing that seemed to see right through the fragile, brittle armor of my anger to the terrified, conflicted woman beneath. And then, he did something I did not expect. He laughed. It was not a loud, boisterous sound. It was a soft, low, and utterly humorless chuckle that was more chilling than any shouted threat. "A monster," he said, his voice a low, conversational thing, as if we were discussing a point of philosophy over a glass of wine. Perhaps. But what, precisely, is a monster? Dr. Reed, is it a man who is willing to do what is necessary to protect what is his? Or is it a woman who is willing to let a man die to protect a quaint, outdated, and utterly meaningless set of principles? He took a step toward me, his presence a suffocating weight in the small, sterile room. "You speak of your oath. First, do no harm, a noble sentiment. But tell me, doctor, what is the greater harm to use your skills to keep this man alive, to give him a chance, however slim, to see another day, or to stand by and watch him die, your hands clean, your conscience clear, your precious oath intact?" He was twisting my own logic, my own morality, into a weapon against me. He was a master of the game, a brilliant, brutal, and utterly captivating devil. "He is a dead man either way," I whispered, my voice a raw, ragged thing. "We are all dead men, doctor," he said, his voice a soft, almost gentle murmur. "Some of us just take longer to fall. You have a choice. You can be a healer, or you can be a witness. Choose." He turned and walked back to the stainless steel table, leaving me alone with my choice, with my patient, with my damnation. I looked at the man in the chair. His eyes were open, a dull, pleading, and utterly terrified brown. He was not a monster. He was not a soldier. He was a man. A weak, foolish man who had made a mistake, and who was now paying for it with his life. And I was a doctor. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and I walked to the table where a sterile medical kit had been laid out for me. My hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. My mind a cold, clear, and analytical machine. I was no longer a terrified, conflicted woman. I was a surgeon, and this was my operating room. The work was a brutal, bloody, and strangely intimate ballet. I worked in silence, my hands moving with a swift, practiced efficiency, my mind a cold, clear, and blessedly empty space. I cleaned his wounds, I sutured his cuts, I set his broken fingers. I worked with a detached, clinical precision. My focus narrowed to the small, illuminated circle of his broken body. Kaito watched me. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood by the wall, a dark, silent sentinel, and he watched. I could feel his gaze on me, a heavy, intense, and utterly unnerving weight. He was not just observing my skill, he was studying me. He was watching me cross a line, a moral event horizon, and he was curious to see what I would become on the other side, when I was finished. The man in the chair was no longer a broken, bloody mess. He was a patched up, repaired, and still utterly terrified man. I had not healed him. I had simply made him ready for the next round of questions, the next round of pain. I stepped back from the chair, my body a numb, trembling, and utterly exhausted vessel. I was covered in his blood, my hands, the hands of a healer, now stained with the evidence of my complicity. I looked at Kaido. His masked face was unreadable, but his eyes, those stormy gray-green eyes, held a new, strange, and utterly terrifying light. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was a flicker of a deep, profound, and utterly dangerous interest. I had not broken. I had not pleaded. I had argued with him. I had challenged him. And then, I had done my job with a flawless, terrifying precision. I had shown him not my weakness, but my strength. And in doing so, I had just become a far more interesting and a far more dangerous captive. You have a gift, Dr. Reed, he said, his voice a low, smooth, and melodic thing. It is not a gift, I retorted, my own voice a raw, ragged thing. It is a curse. A slow, cold smile touched his lips. Perhaps, he said, but it is a curse that now belongs to me. He gestured to his men, who moved forward to untie the now conscious and whimpering Mr. Liang. They dragged him from the room, his pleas for mercy a fading, pathetic echo in the sterile, white corridor. I was left alone with Kaido, with the monster who is now my master, my patient, my partner in a dark and brutal world. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the smell of blood and the ghost of my shattered morality. The game had begun, and I, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had once believed in the clean, sterile, and absolute power of her oath, was now a player, a reluctant, unwilling, and utterly terrified player, in a game where the only rule was survival, and the only prize was another day in the devil's gilded cage. The Devil's Physician, Part 4, The Mask's Secret. The aftermath of my first duty was a descent into a new kind of hell. It was a quiet, internal, and deeply personal torment. The gilded cage of the penthouse, once a symbol of my physical imprisonment, now felt like a reflection of my moral one. I had crossed a line, a bright, sacred line that I had built my entire identity around, and the woman who had existed before that moment was gone. Another casualty in Kaido Tanaka's silent, brutal war. My days fell into a new, more unnerving rhythm. The cold, deliberate ignorance from Kaido was replaced by something far more unsettling his attention. He was no longer a phantom in the periphery of my existence. He was a constant, watchful presence, a predator who had tasted the blood in the water and was now circling, curious and patient. Our encounters were no longer accidental or born of necessity. They were deliberate, calculated, and utterly terrifying. He would seek me out in the library, the vast, silent room that had become my sanctuary and my prison. He would not speak of the man in the chair, of the blood on my hands. He would speak of philosophy. He would stand by the window, a dark, imposing silhouette against the glittering, indifferent city, and he would engage me in a series of intense, intellectual debates that were estranged, twisted, and utterly captivating form of psychological warfare. He would question my morality, my idealism, the very foundations of my carefully constructed world. "You believe in a world of absolutes, Doctor," he said one evening, his voice a low, melodic thing that was a terrifying counterpoint to the darkness of his words, a world of right and wrong, of good and evil. But the world is not a sterile, black-and-white operating room. It is a messy, gray, and often brutal place, and in a gray world. A man who clings to absolutes is not a saint. He is a fool. "And what are you, Cato?" I retorted. My own voice a cool, steady thing, a poor imitation of his own icy control, a pragmatist, a survivor. A slow, cold smile touched his lips. "I am a king in a kingdom of monsters," he said, his voice a soft, almost gentle murmur. "And a king who shows mercy is a king who will soon have his head on a pike." He was trying to understand me, to map the secret corridors of my mind, to deconstruct the moral framework that he found so quaint. He began to leave me gifts, not of jewels or couture, but of books. A first edition of Nietzsche, a leather-bound copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, a slim volume of ancient brutal Japanese poetry. Each one was a challenge, a lesson, a piece of his own dark, nihilistic soul that he was offering me. I read them all. I devoured them. And in their dark, unapologetic pages, I began, to my own horror, to see a flicker of a terrible, seductive logic. The tension between us was no longer just the raw, physical tension of a captor and his captive. It was something more complex, more dangerous. It was the tension of two sharp, analytical minds locked in a deadly, intimate dance. I found myself, to my own shame and terror, looking forward to our verbal sparring matches, to the sharp, exhilarating thrill of meeting his brilliant, brutal mind with my own. He was a monster, but he was a brilliant, captivating, and utterly fascinating one. And I, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had once believed in the clean, sterile, and absolute power of her oath, was beginning to find the darkness as compelling as the light. The first sign that something was wrong was a small, almost imperceptible thing, a subtle tremor in his hand as he lifted a glass of whiskey to his lips, a faint, almost invisible sheen of sweat on the pale, unmasked skin of his forehead, a slight, almost imperceptible unsteadiness in his usually fluid, predatory grace. I was a doctor. I was trained to see the small, subtle signs of a body at war with itself, and Kaido's body was losing a war. "You're not well," I said one evening, my voice a flat, clinical statement of fact. We were in the library, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the unspoken tension that was now our constant companion. He looked up from the ancient go board we had been using as our silent battlefield. His eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, narrowing to cold, sharp slits. "I am fine," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have a fever," I said, my own voice a cool, steady counterpoint to his rising anger. "Your skin is flushed, your pupils are dilated, and your hands are not steady. You have an infection, a bad one, likely a complication from your surgery. I am not your patient." He snarled, his voice a whip crack of pure, undiluted fury. "You are a fool," I retorted. My own anger, a hot, searing, and utterly reckless thing, rising to meet his. "You are a king in a kingdom of monsters, Kaido, And a king who shows weakness, a king who allows his own body to betray him, is a king who will soon have his head on a pike. I had used his own words against him, had turned his own cold, brutal logic into a weapon. The shock on his face was a fleeting, almost imperceptible thing. But it was there. He had expected fear, submission. He had not expected his own ruthless pragmatism to be thrown back in his face. The battle of wills that followed was a silent, brutal thing. He refused to be examined. He refused to be vulnerable. His control was his armor, his shield, the very foundation of his power. And he would rather die than let me, his prisoner, his possession, see him weak. But the infection did not care for his pride. It was a relentless, insidious, and utterly democratic enemy. It raged through his body, a silent, unseen war that he was losing. He collapsed 2 days later. He was in his office, a stark modern room of glass and steel that was the command center of his dark kingdom. I was not there. I was in my own suite, a prisoner in my gilded cage. It was Mr. Chen who found him, a crumpled, unconscious heap on the cold, marble floor. The panic that followed was a quiet, controlled, and utterly terrifying thing. Mr. Chen and his men, the silent, black-clad soldiers who had once been my jailers, were in a state of barely suppressed terror. They were warriors, not doctors. They were masters of violence, not of healing. Their king was dying, and they were powerless to stop it. And so, they came to me. The power shift was a sudden, violent, and utterly dizzying thing. One moment, I was a prisoner, a possession, a tool. The next, I was the one in command. The master was now at the mercy of his slave. I turned his vast, opulent suite into a makeshift ICU. I barked orders at the menacing, tattooed men who were now my assistants, my nurses, my unwilling and terrified students. They followed my commands with a desperate, unquestioning obedience, their fear of losing their king far greater than their pride. Kaido was burning with fever. His body was a battlefield, the infection a raging, out-of-control fire. Sepsis was setting in, the deadly, systemic response of a body at war with itself. I worked with a frantic, desperate, and utterly focused intensity. I pumped him full of antibiotics, of fluids, of every weapon in my medical arsenal. It was a desperate, brutal, and intimate battle. A fight not just for his life, but for my own. He was delirious, his iron control shattered by the fever. He thrashed in the vast, silk-sheeted bed, his powerful body a prison of pain. He murmured in Japanese, his voice a raw, ragged thing, the words a torrent of a language I did not understand. But I did not need to understand the words. I could hear the raw, unadulterated pain, the deep, ancient anguish in his tone. He was not the cold, controlled conductor. He was a man, a broken man, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The fever raged for 2 days and 2 nights. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I was a machine, a finely tuned instrument of healing. My entire being focused on the single, all-consuming task of keeping him alive. The crisis came on the second night. His body was racked with a violent, uncontrollable convulsion. He thrashed his head from side to side, a raw, guttural sound of pure, animalistic pain tearing from his throat. And in the violence of the seizure, the sleek, black, and utterly terrifying mask that had been a permanent, impenetrable part of his face was dislodged. It clattered to the marble floor with a soft, almost gentle sound that was a terrifying counterpoint to the violence in the bed. I froze, my hands, which had been holding him down, stilling in midair. The room was silent, save for the sound of his ragged, desperate breaths, and in the dim, soft light of the bedside lamp. I saw it. I saw his face, the real one. It was not just a scar. It was a ruin, a devastating, old wound that was a testament to a horror I could not begin to comprehend. The right side of his face was a hellscape of melted, puckered tissue, the cheekbone gone, the skin grafted and pulled tight in a way that gave his unmasked face a permanent, tragic, and utterly heartbreaking snarl. It was a horrific, deeply traumatic injury that spoke not of a simple gang fight, not of a single, clean act of violence, but of something far worse. It spoke of fire. It spoke of a pain so profound, so absolute. It had reshaped the very foundations of his being. I stood there, my heart a cold, hard knot of a new, unfamiliar emotion in my chest. It was not fear. It was not revulsion. It was a sudden, profound, and utterly unwelcome wave of compassion. This was the source of his pain. This was the reason for his monstrous control. This was the face of the boy who had been forged in the flames. My hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. I reached out, my fingers a soft, gentle, and almost reverent touch against the ruined landscape of his face. I cleaned the scarred, puckered skin, my touch clinical, but also impossibly tender. It was an act of profound, almost sacred intimacy. He quieted under my touch, his fevered, thrashing body going still, his ragged breaths evening out. He was not conscious, but on some deep, primal level. His tortured mind seemed to sense a moment of kindness, of comfort. In the heart of his delirium, I worked through the night, a silent, solitary vigil at the bedside of the devil. I fought the infection. I fought the fever. I fought the ghosts that haunted him. And as the first, pale light of a new day crept through the vast, panoramic window, the fever broke. He drifted into a true, healing sleep, his breathing deep and even, his unmasked, vulnerable face peaceful for the first time since I had met him. I was left alone in the quiet room, the only sound the soft, steady beep of the heart monitor, a triumphant, beautiful, and utterly profane symphony. I sank into a chair by his bedside, my body a numb, trembling, and utterly exhausted vessel. I looked at the man in the bed, at the unmasked, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly beautiful face of the devil. The dynamic between us had been irrevocably, dangerously altered. I no longer just feared him. I no longer just hated him. I pitied him, and in his world, in his dark, brutal, and unforgiving kingdom, pity was a far more dangerous and a far more powerful weapon than hatred. The game had changed, and I, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had once been his prisoner, was now, in a strange, terrifying, and utterly unexpected way, his keeper. The Devil's Physician Part 5. A Poisonous Cure. Kaido's recovery was as swift and silent as his violence. He was a man whose will was a physical force, a tangible thing that seemed to knit his flesh and bone back together through sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. Within days, the fever was a distant memory, the delirium a ghost that had been banished back to the darkest corners of his soul. He was once again the cold, controlled, and utterly terrifying king of his glittering, corrupt kingdom. But everything had changed. The mask was back in place, a sleek, black, and impenetrable barrier that once again hid the ruined landscape of his face. But I knew what lay beneath. I had seen it. I had touched it. And that knowledge was a new, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating form of power. The dynamic between us had been irrevocably, dangerously altered. He was no longer just my captor, and I was no longer just his prisoner. The power shift was a subtle, unspoken, and utterly seismic thing. He was the master of a vast, violent empire, a man who could command armies and topple governments with a single, quiet word. But in the dead of night, in the heart of his own delirium, I had been his keeper. I had held his life in my hands, and we both knew it. His attention, which had once been a cold, clinical, and terrifying thing, was now a constant, burning, and utterly possessive force. He no longer sought me out for our twisted, intellectual debates in the library. He simply was. A dark, silent presence in the periphery of my existence. His eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, always on me. I would be reading in the library, and I would feel the weight of his gaze from the doorway. I would be playing the piano, my fingers finding a strange, melancholy solace in the cool, smooth keys, and I would see his reflection, a dark, still figure in the polished black wood. He was a hunter who had decided not to kill his prey, but to study it, to learn its rhythms, its fears, its desires, and I, to my own shame and terror, found myself performing for him. My music became a conversation, a confession, a raw, emotional, and utterly honest dialogue that I could not speak in words. I played the pieces that mirrored the chaos in my own soul, the turbulent passions of Rachmaninoff, the dark, brooding melancholy of Brahms, the stark, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking loneliness of Chopin. And he listened. He stood in the shadows, a silent, solitary audience. And he listened, and in the charged, humming silence between the notes, I knew that he understood. The peace, if such a fragile, tense, and utterly terrifying thing could be called peace, was shattered by a whisper from the outside world, a whisper that reminded me that our strange, twisted, and increasingly intimate world was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. It began with a small, almost insignificant detail, a single discordant note in the otherwise perfect, brutal symphony of Kaido's world. A key shipment of uncut diamonds, a routine, low-level transaction that was the lifeblood of his money-laundering operations, went missing. It was not a clumsy, brutish hijacking. It was a clean, surgical, and utterly professional theft. A ghost operation that left no tracks, no witnesses, only the faint, chilling scent of a new, more intelligent enemy. Then came the second whisper, a trusted associate, a man who ran Kaido's junket operations, the lifeblood of his casino empire, was found dead in his lavish apartment. An apparent victim of a high-end call girl who had robbed him and vanished into the city's neon-drenched night. But the details didn't add up. It was too neat, too clean. It was a message, a declaration of war. The Azure Palace, once a silent, opulent prison, became a fortress, a war room. The air was thick with a new, more palpable tension, the low, humming vibration of a predator preparing for battle. Kaido's men, the silent, black-clad soldiers who had once been my jailers, were now a constant, visible presence, their faces grim, their eyes hard and watchful. Kaido was a creature of pure, focused, and terrifyingly beautiful violence. He was a king defending his kingdom, a predator whose territory had been challenged. The cold, almost academic detachment was gone, replaced by a raw, simmering, and utterly deadly fury. And he drew me into his war. He no longer left me to the silent, solitary confinement of the library. He brought me into his office, the stark, modern command center of his dark kingdom. He would spread out financial reports, surveillance logs, and maps of the city on the massive, glass and steel desk, and he would explain them to me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, his explanations a cold, precise, and utterly fascinating lecture on the art of war. I was not just his doctor now. I was his counsel, his strategist, his partner. He valued my mind, my outsider's perspective, my ability to see the patterns in the chaos. And I, in turn, found myself drawn deeper and deeper into his dark, violent, and utterly captivating world. My medical knowledge, the sacred, healing art that I had once believed was my only identity, became a weapon in his war. I was not just patching up his soldiers after the fact. I was a part of the planning, the strategy. I would analyze the patterns of injury on the bodies of our enemies, providing intelligence on their tactics, their weaponry, their training. I could tell, from the angle of a bullet wound, the position of the shooter. I could tell, from the nature of a knife wound, the skill of the man who wielded it. I was a healer who had learned to read the language of death. The men who had once looked at me with a mixture of fear and contempt. The hard, tattooed soldiers who were the pillars of Kaido's empire, now looked at me with a new, grudging, and almost fearful respect. I was no longer just the boss's pet, the fragile, foreign doctor. I was a part of the machine. I was a weapon. The rival triad, a mainland Chinese organization known as the Golden Scorpions, were a new, more dangerous kind of enemy. They were not the brutish, predictable thugs of the local Macau gangs. They were intelligent, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. And they were led by a man who was a dark, twisted mirror of Kaido himself, a man known only as the Alchemist. The war escalated. It was a silent, deadly chess match played out on the glittering, corrupt board of Macau. For every move Kaido made, the Alchemist had a counter-move. For every asset we neutralized, they took one of ours. It was a stalemate, a slow, corrosive, and bloody war of attrition. And then, the Alchemist made his final, audacious move. He decided to take the king. The attack came on a Tuesday. It was a cold, clear night. The sky a vast, inky canvas pricked with the sharp, distant light of a million stars. The city of Macau spread out beneath us, a glittering, indifferent carpet of diamonds. We were in the penthouse, in Kaido's office. We were working late. A bottle of expensive Japanese whiskey and a half-empty ashtray on the desk between us. The air was thick with the scent of old paper. Good whiskey, and the comfortable, almost domestic intimacy that had grown between us. The first sign that something was wrong was a small, almost imperceptible flicker of the lights. The second was the sudden, absolute silence, the low, steady hum of the building's climate control. A sound I had grown so accustomed to it had become a part of the penthouse's silence. Suddenly, abruptly, cut out, Kaido was on his feet in an instant, his body a coiled spring of pure, predatory instinct. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply moved, a blur of motion, and he was at my side, his hand a band of steel around my arm, pulling me from my chair, pulling me down behind the massive, solid desk. The world exploded. The floor-to-ceiling, bulletproof window that made up one entire wall of the office shattered inward. A deafening, earth-shattering roar of sound and a shower of a million glittering, razor-sharp shards of glass. A team of black-clad figures, their faces obscured by tactical masks, rappelled down from the roof, their movements the swift, silent, and utterly professional motions of a special forces team. The penthouse, my gilded cage, my strange, twisted sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The firefight was a chaotic, deafening, and utterly terrifying symphony of violence. Kaido's men, who had been stationed throughout the penthouse, responded with a brutal, disciplined efficiency. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, the sound of automatic weapon fire a deafening, staccato rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Kaido was a creature of pure, beautiful, and terrifying violence. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, a pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was not a wild, frantic brawler. He was a surgeon, a master of his craft, his movements precise, economical, lethal. I was not a soldier. I was not a killer. I was a doctor. And in the heart of the chaos, in the crucible of the firefight, my own training, my own instincts, took over. I was not a liability. I was an asset. I became Kaido's eyes, his spotter, my mind a cold, clear, and analytical machine. I saw the patterns in the chaos, the angles, the trajectories. I would call out the position of an enemy, the direction of a threat. My voice, a calm, steady counterpoint to the deafening roar of the battle. And then, I saw it. A single, almost invisible tripwire. A thin, translucent filament stretched across the doorway of the office. A trap, a final, deadly surprise from the alchemist. Kaido was moving toward the door, his focus on the firefight raging in the main living area of the penthouse. He did not see it. There was no time to shout, no time to warn him. I did the only thing I could do. I moved. I launched myself from behind the desk, a blur of motion, and I tackled him, my body crashing into his, sending us both sprawling to the marble floor. The explosion was a deafening, concussive blast that ripped the door from its hinges and sent a wave of heat and shrapnel tearing through the space where Kaido had been standing a second before. The silence that followed was a ringing, deafening thing, thick with the smell of explosives and the dust of pulverized plaster. I was lying on top of Kaido, my body a shield, my ears ringing, my mind a numb, buzzing blank. He rolled us over, his body now covering mine, a protective, solid weight. He was breathing hard, his face inches from my own. His mask was gone, lost in the chaos of the explosion. His ruined, beautiful, and utterly vulnerable face exposed in the dim, flickering emergency lights. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a raw, ragged thing, his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, a dark, stormy sea of 100 unreadable emotions. "No," I whispered, my own voice a shaky, trembling thing. He looked at me then, at the woman who had just saved his life. Not with the skills of a surgeon, but with the quick, selfless, and utterly insane instincts of a soldier. And in his eyes, I saw it, the final, absolute, and utter shattering of the last, fragile remnants of his control. He leaned in and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not a kiss of possession. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated, and utterly desperate gratitude. It was a kiss that was a promise, a vow, a silent, sacred, and utterly binding contract. The battle for the Azure Palace was over. The alchemist's gambit had failed. But the war for our souls, for our future, for the strange, twisted, and beautiful thing that had been born between us in the heart of the violence, had just begun. In the aftermath, as we stood in the ruins of his office, the city of Macau a glittering, indifferent carpet of diamonds outside the shattered, gaping wound of the window, he turned to me. He was no longer the cold, controlled king. He was a man, a scarred, broken, and beautiful man. And he was mine. "You saved my life, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "You saved mine first," I whispered back. A slow, sad, and utterly beautiful smile touched his lips. "It seems," he said, his voice a soft, almost gentle murmur, "that we are even." But we were not even. We were bound. We were two halves of a dark, dangerous, and utterly perfect whole. We were the devil and his doctor, and our story, our warped, beautiful, and utterly terrifying symphony, was just beginning. The Devil's Physician, Part 6. The Intimate Interrogation. The aftermath of the attack was a strange, suspended reality. The penthouse, once a symbol of my gilded imprisonment, was now a fortress, a command center, and a shared, intimate battlefield. The shattered window had been replaced with a seamless sheet of reinforced glass, but the ghost of the explosion lingered, a constant, humming reminder of the night the war had come to our door. The professional and emotional lines between Kaido and me were not just blurred, they had been annihilated. I was no longer just his physician, a reluctant asset in his employ. I was the woman who had saved his life, not with a scalpel, but with a desperate primal act of self-sacrifice, and he was no longer just my captor, the cold, masked king of this glittering, corrupt kingdom. He was a man whose vulnerability I had witnessed, whose life I had held in my hands. This shared, brutal knowledge was a new, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating form of intimacy. Our relationship became a dark, consuming affair, a series of stolen moments in the heart of a war zone. It was not a relationship of love, not in any conventional sense. It was a relationship of obsession, of a fierce, intellectual sparring, and of a desperate, shared loneliness. We were two solitary, damaged souls who had found a strange, terrifying, and beautiful reflection in each other's darkness. He was a man who controlled a city, who could make empires rise and fall with a single, quiet word. But he could not control me, and I, a woman who had once believed in the clean, sterile, and absolute power of her oath, was beginning to find a strange, terrifying, and beautiful kind of freedom in his dark, violent, and utterly consuming world. The war with the golden scorpions, with the ghost known only as the alchemist, escalated. The failed attack on the penthouse had been a declaration of intent, a brazen, audacious move that had shaken the very foundations of Cato's empire. The alchemist was not just a rival, he was a phantom, a master of a new kind of warfare, a warfare of chaos and terror. Our days were a study in controlled, focused violence. We were a two-person war council, our world shrinking to the confines of Kaido's office, A stark modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of our shared kingdom. We would spend hours poring over financial records that were written in a language of blood and money, surveillance reports that were a testament to the city's secret sins, and maps of Macau that were not just geographical documents, but strategic battle plans. Our nights were a different kind of war, a different kind of strategy. They were a desperate, frantic, and beautiful thing, a temporary truce in the larger battle for our lives. We would come together in the darkness, two damaged, lonely souls, and in the raw, brutal honesty of our physical connection, we would find a strange, fleeting kind of peace. He would touch me with a reverence that was at odds with the killer he was. His hands, one smooth and perfect, the other a canvas of dark, violent ink, mapping my body as if it were a new, undiscovered country, and I, in turn, would cling to him, my body a willing surrender, my heart a traitorous, fluttering thing in my chest. The first major breakthrough in the war came in the form of a man, a key lieutenant of the Golden Scorpions. A man known as the Serpent was captured in a brutal, bloody raid on a rival casino. He was not just a soldier, he was a strategist. A man who was said to be the alchemist's right hand. He was the first real link to the ghost who was trying to burn our world to the ground. He was brought to the penthouse, to the sterile, white interrogation room that had been the site of my own moral downfall. But this time, I was not a reluctant, horrified observer. I was a participant. "I need you there," Kaito said, his voice a low, flat, and utterly non-negotiable thing. We were in his office, the city of Macau a glittering, indifferent carpet of diamonds outside the vast panoramic window. Why, I asked. My own voice a cool, steady counterpoint to the wild, frantic beating of my heart. "Because you see things I do not," he said, his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, holding mine. You see the man, not just the soldier. You see the weaknesses he does not even know he has. And, he added, his voice dropping to a low, almost intimate murmur, you are a doctor. You know the precise, delicate, and beautiful mechanics of pain. He was not asking me to be a healer. He was asking me to be a weapon. He was asking me to take the sacred, healing art that was the core of my identity, and to twist it into an instrument of torture. And I, to my own shame and terror, did not refuse. The interrogation was not a chaotic, frenzied beating. It was a cold, methodical, and terrifyingly precise process. It was a symphony of violence, and Kaito was its conductor. The Serpent was a hard man, a man who had been forged in the brutal, unforgiving world of the triads. He was not afraid of pain, he was not afraid of death, but he was afraid of Kaito. Kaito did not raise his voice. He did not lay a hand on the man himself. He simply stood in the corner of the sterile, white room, a dark, silent sentinel, and he directed his men with quiet, chilling, and brutally efficient commands, and I stood beside him. I was not just an observer, I was a participant. I was his instrument, my medical knowledge, the sacred, healing art that I had once believed was my only identity, became a weapon in his war. I would monitor the Serpent's vital signs, the steady, rhythmic beat of the heart monitor a strange, profane counterpoint to the low, guttural sounds of his pain. I would advise Kaito on the precise, delicate, and beautiful mechanics of his suffering. I could tell, from the dilation of his pupils, the sweat on his brow, the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands when he was lying, when he was telling the truth, when he was on the verge of breaking. It was a dark, twisted, and utterly intoxicating form of intimacy. We were two minds, two souls, working in perfect, brutal harmony. He was the violence, and I was the precision. He was the storm, and I was the calm. Analytical I at its center. The interrogation lasted for 2 days and 2 nights. It was a slow, corrosive, and utterly relentless process. The serpent was a strong man, but we were stronger. We were a perfect, terrifying, and utterly unbeatable team. He broke on the second night. He was a broken, sobbing, and utterly defeated man. His body a canvas of our shared, brutal artistry, and in his brokenness, he gave us what we wanted. He gave us a name, not the alchemist's name, but the name of a man who was the key, the linchpin, the ghost in the machine. A man who was supposed to be dead. A man from Kaito's own past. The name was a key that unlocked a door in Kaito's mind. A door that had been locked and barred for a lifetime. The story came out in a torrent, a flood of a pain he had kept hidden even from me. The story of the fire, the story of his family's murder, the story of the man who had ordered it. The man the serpent named was not just a rival. He was the architect of Kaito's pain, the ghost who had haunted his every waking moment, the man who had made him a monster. The interrogation was over, but the war had just become personal. In the aftermath, in the quiet, sterile, and blood-spattered interrogation room, Kaito turned to me. His masked face was unreadable, but his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, were a dark, stormy sea of 100 unreadable emotions. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply reached out and pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing. A silent, violent acknowledgement of the dark, twisted, and unbreakable bond that had been forged between us. He kissed me then, a raw, brutal, and beautiful kiss that tasted of blood and whiskey and the shared, intoxicating, and utterly profane taste of victory. I kissed him back, my own desperation matching his, a raw, hungry need for the life, the heat, the brutal, beautiful reality of him. I was no longer just his doctor. I was no longer just his queen. I was his partner, his equal, his other half. We were two dark, broken souls who had found a perfect, albeit twisted, harmony in the shadows. We were the devil and his doctor, and our war, our beautiful, brutal, and utterly consuming war, had just begun. The Devil's Physician, Part 7. The Ghost of the Past. The aftermath of the interrogation was not a victory celebration. There was no champagne, no triumphant toasts. The victory was a heavy, somber, and deeply unsettling thing that settled over the penthouse like a shroud. The serpent was gone, a broken, empty vessel handed over to Kaito's silent, efficient cleaners. But he had left behind a ghost, a name, a key that had unlocked a Pandora's box of pain and memory in the heart of the man I had come to know. Kaito was changed, the cold, controlled, and utterly brilliant strategist who had waged a war for the soul of Macau was gone. In his place was a man haunted, a man consumed by a ghost from a past I knew nothing about. He retreated into a silence that was different from his usual cold, calculated reserve. This was a silence of a man drowning in his own memories, a man reliving a nightmare that had been dormant for a lifetime. He did not speak of the name the serpent had given him. He did not speak of the war. He simply was a dark, brooding, and utterly terrifying presence in the vast, silent spaces of the penthouse. He would stand for hours by the panoramic window, his masked face turned toward the glittering, indifferent city, but his eyes, I knew, were seeing something else entirely. They were seeing a past that was a landscape of fire and ash, our nights, which had become a strange, twisted, and beautiful sanctuary, were now a study in a new kind of intimacy, an intimacy of shared, silent pain. I would lie beside him in the vast, dark bed, my body a silent, comforting presence, and I would listen to the sound of his ragged, uneven breaths. He was not sleeping. He was fighting a war in the landscape of his own mind, a war that was far more brutal and far more personal than the one we were waging for the soul of Macau. I did not push. I did not pry. I simply waited. I was a doctor, and I knew that some wounds, the deepest ones, the ones that festered in the soul, could not be forced open. They had to be allowed to bleed. The story came out on a Tuesday. It was a cold, clear night. The sky a vast inky canvas pricked with the sharp, distant light of a million stars. We were in his office, the only light the green glow of a banker's lamp, a bottle of expensive Japanese whiskey on the desk between us. He had been silent for hours, a dark, brooding statue of a man. And then, he spoke. I was not born into this life. Evelyn, he said, his voice a low, rough, and utterly unfamiliar thing. He did not look at me. He stared at the glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. My father was a doctor, he said, his voice a strange, almost reverent whisper. A brilliant one, a surgeon, like you. But he was more than that. He was a researcher, a visionary. He was working on something revolutionary, a new kind of gene therapy, a way to rewrite the very code of life, to cure the incurable. He took a long, slow swallow of his whiskey. He was a good man, a kind man, a man who believed in the sacred, healing power of his art. He was a man who believed in a world of absolutes, a world of right and wrong, of good and evil. He was a fool. The last word was a bitter, self-loathing thing, a word that was a condemnation not of his father, but of himself. We lived in Kyoto, he said, his voice a low, almost hypnotic murmur, in a beautiful, old house with paper screens and a garden that was my mother's pride and joy. It was a world of peace, of beauty, of a quiet, scholarly love. It was a world that was a lie. He told me of his childhood, a world so far removed from the brutal, violent reality of his present that it felt like a fairy tale. He spoke of his mother, a gentle, beautiful woman who taught him the art of calligraphy. He spoke of his younger brother, a small, bright, and utterly fearless boy who was the light of his life. And then, he spoke of the fire. He had a partner, he said, his voice a flat, emotionless thing. A voice that was a testament to a pain so profound it had been burned beyond the reach of tears. His own brother, my uncle, a man who was not a healer, but a businessman. A man who saw my father's work not as a gift to humanity, but as a commodity, a product to be sold to the highest bidder. The story was a classic, brutal, and utterly timeless tale of greed and betrayal. The uncle, Kenji Tanaka, wanted to sell the research to a powerful Yakuza clan. The father, a man of principle, of honor, refused. And so, the uncle, A man who was not a monster of brute force, but a monster of the mind, a creature of cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless ambition, made a decision. He decided to erase the problem. He did not do it himself. He was too clever for that. He hired the Yakuza, the same clan he had been in business with, to send a message, a warning. But the message, as they so often do in his world, got out of hand. The warning became a fire. The fire became a massacre. Kaido was a boy, just 10 years old. He had been hiding, playing a game of hide and seek with his younger brother. He had watched, from the cramped, dark space of a closet, as the monsters came. He had watched as they had killed his father, his mother, his brother. He had watched as they had set his world on fire. He was the only one who had survived. He had been left for dead in the burning ruins of his home, his face a ruin, his body a canvas of a pain so profound it had reshaped the very foundations of his being. He was found by a man who was not a doctor, not a healer, but a different kind of savior, the old, childless head of the Azure Dragon Triad in Macau. A man who had been a secret, silent partner in his father's research, a man who had been waiting for the results of his work. He had not found a cure. He had found a survivor, a boy with a fire in his eyes that was hotter, more dangerous, and far more useful than any medical breakthrough. He had given the boy a new name, a new life, a new purpose. He had taken the broken, scarred, and utterly traumatized child, and he had forged him into a weapon. He had taught him the art of violence, of strategy, of a cold, ruthless pragmatism. He had made him a monster, and he had set him on a path of a long, patient, and utterly consuming revenge. The man the serpent had named was not just a rival. He was not just a ghost from Kaido's past. He was the architect of his pain. The man who had ordered the fire. The man who had stolen his life. He was Kenji Tanaka, Kaido's uncle. The man who had taken his brother's research and had built a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire on the ashes of his family. The war was no longer just a battle for territory in Macau. It was a personal vendetta, a blood feud, a lifelong quest for a justice that could only be found in the heart of a final, bloody, and utterly devastating revenge when he finished his story. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the ghosts of a past that was no longer just his, but ours. I did not speak. I did not offer empty words of comfort. I simply went to him, my own heart aching with a pain that was a mirror of his own. And I wrapped my arms around him. He was a wall of ice and steel, but for the first time, he did not push me away. He leaned into me, his large, powerful body trembling with the force of a grief he had held inside for a lifetime. We were no longer just captor and captive, doctor and patient, lover and lover. We were two survivors, two soldiers, two partners in a war that was no longer just about power, but about justice. The discovery of Kenji Tanaka's identity was not a victory. It was a death sentence. It meant that the war was no longer just a battle for the soul of Macau. It was a battle for the soul of Kaido himself. Kenji Tanaka was not a common gangster. He was a legitimate, powerful, and utterly untouchable billionaire, a pillar of Hong Kong society, a man who was surrounded by a fortress of wealth, power, and influence. A direct assault was impossible. It would be suicide. We needed a new strategy, a more subtle, more insidious, and far more dangerous one. We needed a ghost of our own, a weapon that could move in his world, a weapon that could get close to him, a weapon that he would never see coming. And as I stood there, in the heart of the devil's dark kingdom, holding the broken, beautiful, and utterly terrifying man I had fallen in love with, I knew, with a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying certainty, what that weapon was. It was me, my old life, my life as Dr. Evelyn Reed, the brilliant, idealistic surgeon from Hong Kong. The life I had thought was gone forever was now our greatest asset. I was the key. I was the one who could move in his world, who could speak his language, who could get close to him in a way that Kaito, the masked, monstrous king of Macau's underworld, never could. The plan began to form in my mind, a cold, clear, and utterly audacious strategy. I would return to Hong Kong. I would reclaim my old life. I would use my credentials, my reputation, my skills, to infiltrate Kenji Tanaka's world. I would become his doctor, his confidant, his weakness. I would be the poison in his veins, the ghost in his machine. I would be the instrument of Kaito's revenge. The thought was a terrifying, exhilarating, and deeply seductive thing. It was a final, absolute, and utter surrender to the darkness. It was a final, brutal, and beautiful act of love. I pulled away from Kaito and looked at him, my eyes holding his, my own face a mask of a new, unfamiliar, and utterly unforgiving resolve. I will do it, I said, my voice a quiet, steady, and utterly final thing. I will go back. I will get close to him, and I will help you burn his world to the ground. The look in his eyes was a mixture of a raw, terrifying fear and a fierce, proud, and utterly devastating love. He knew what I was offering. He knew the danger. He knew the cost. He did not speak. He simply reached out and pulled me to him, his mouth finding mine in a kiss that was not a kiss of passion, not a kiss of possession, but a kiss of a shared, dark, and utterly binding purpose. It was a kiss that was a promise, a vow, a silent, sacred, and utterly terrifying contract. The game had changed, and I, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had once been a healer, was now a hunter, and my prey was waiting for me in a glittering, corrupt, and utterly unsuspecting city across the sea. The Devil's Physician Part 8, The Surgeon's Choice. The aftermath of Kaito's confession was not a return to the cold, hostile silence that had defined my first weeks in Macau. It was something far more unnerving. A new, fragile, and utterly terrifying accord had been struck between us. A silent acknowledgement that I had not broken under the weight of his brutal education. I had bent. I had been horrified. But I had endured. And in my endurance, a new, dangerous dynamic had been born. The house was no longer just a gilded cage, it was a chessboard. And I, who had been nothing more than a pawn, was beginning to understand the game. Kaito's lessons continued, but their nature shifted. He no longer treated me as a fragile, ignorant American girl who needed to be shocked into submission. He began to treat me as an apprentice, a reluctant but intelligent student of his dark and brutal world. He would bring me files, not of past atrocities, but of current operations shipping manifests, financial reports, surveillance logs. He would spread them out on the massive, polished mahogany desk in the library, and he would explain them to me. His voice, a low, gravelly rumble. His explanations a cold, precise, and utterly fascinating lecture on the mechanics of a criminal empire. I listened. I learned. I absorbed the information with the same focused, analytical intensity I had once applied to my historical texts. I learned the coded language of his world, the subtle nuances of a business deal that was really a threat, the hidden meanings in a financial transaction that was really an act of war. Our evenings in the library became a strange, almost surreal ritual. We would sit on opposite sides of the massive desk, the only light the green glow of a banker's lamp, the only sound the soft rustle of paper and the low, steady cadence of his voice. It was a strange, almost academic intimacy, a meeting of two sharp, analytical minds in the heart of a dark and violent world. The tension between us was a constant, humming thing, a live wire that stretched across the polished expanse of the desk. It was no longer just the raw, physical tension of our first, brutal kiss. It was something more complex, more dangerous. It was the tension of two predators circling each other, a mixture of distrust, a grudging respect, and a dark, undeniable, and utterly terrifying curiosity. I began to see the man behind the monster, the strategist behind the brute. I saw the sharp, incisive intelligence in his eyes as he explained a complex financial scheme. I saw the cold, ruthless pragmatism that guided his every decision. He was not a mindless thug, he was a king, a brilliant, brutal, and utterly captivating one, and he, in turn, began to see me. He saw the quick, analytical mind behind my quiet, reserved demeanor. He saw the historian's ability to see patterns in chaos, to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent narrative. He would ask for my opinion, his pale, chilling eyes holding a new, strange intensity as he listened to my analysis. "You think like your father," he said one night, his voice a low, almost thoughtful murmur. It was the first time he had mentioned my father in a way that was not a cold, dismissive statement of fact. "I never knew my father," I retorted, my voice a cool, steady thing, not the real one. Anyway, he looked at me then, his gaze a sharp, piercing thing that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed walls of my composure. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low, almost gentle rumble. "You are more like him than you know." The words were a strange, unsettling, and oddly comforting thing. They were an acknowledgement, a validation, a thread of connection to a past I was only just beginning to understand. But the fragile, almost academic piece of our new routine was shattered by a whisper from the outside world. A whisper that reminded me that this was not a game, not a scholarly exercise. This was a war, and I was not just a student, I was a target. It began with a small, innocuous detail. A single discordant note in the otherwise perfect, brutal symphony of Dimitri's world, a shipment of weapons, a routine, low-level transaction, went missing. It was a minor loss, a nuisance, but the way it happened, the clean, almost surgical precision of the theft, was unsettling. It spoke of inside knowledge. It spoke of a new, more intelligent enemy. Then came the second whisper, a key political contact. A man who had been on the Petrova payroll for years was found dead in his apartment. An apparent suicide. But the details didn't add up. It was too neat, too clean. It was a message. I was the one who found the connection. I was in the library, poring over the old Petrova family archives, the leather-bound ledgers that detailed a century of blood and business. I was looking for something, anything, that would give me a better understanding of the world I now inhabited. And I found it. A faded, almost forgotten entry from my grandfather's time, detailing a brief, bloody, and ultimately disastrous alliance with a rival family, the Chekhovs, the same name Orlov had mentioned on that first terrible day. The historical records were a dry, emotionless account of a business deal gone wrong, a betrayal, and a brutal, bloody retaliation. But as I read, a cold, prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. The details of the old conflict, the tactics, the strategies, the subtle, psychological warfare. They were a mirror image of what was happening now, the missing shipment, the suicide. They were not random acts of aggression. They were moves in a game, a long, patient, and deadly game of chess. I took my findings to Dmitri. I found him in his office, a stark modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of his dark kingdom. He was standing by the window, staring out at the gray, snow-dusted city, his back to me. I laid the old, leather-bound ledger on his desk, my finger tracing the faded, spidery script of my grandfather's hand. "It's them," I said, my voice a low, steady thing. "The Chekhovs. This isn't a new war. It's an old one. And they're not just attacking your business. They're coming for the family. They're coming for me." He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter sky outside. He looked at the ledger, then at me. A long, silent moment stretched between us, a moment where I felt like I was being weighed, measured, and judged. "You are right," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He walked to the desk and stood beside me, his presence a solid, intimidating wall of heat and muscle. He looked down at the open ledger, his large, tattooed hand resting on the page beside my own. "This is not just business. This is personal." The admission was a subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. He was no longer just my teacher, my jailer. He was my protector. And I was no longer just his student, his prisoner. I was his partner, a reluctant, unwilling, and terrified partner. But a partner nonetheless. The whispers of war became a roar. The Chekhovs, emboldened by their initial successes, escalated their attacks. They were no longer content with subtle, strategic moves. They began a campaign of terror, a series of brutal, public displays of violence designed to destabilize Dmitri's power and spread fear throughout his organization. A car bomb exploded outside one of our nightclubs, a bloody, fiery message that killed 3 of Dmitri's men and a dozen innocent civilians. A key lieutenant was gunned down in broad daylight as he left his son's school. The attacks were a direct, brazen challenge to Dmitri's authority. A declaration of all-out war. The mansion, once a silent, oppressive prison, became a fortress, a war room. The air was thick with a new, more palpable tension, the low, humming vibration of a predator preparing for battle. Dmitri's men, the silent, black-clad soldiers who had once been my jailers, were now a constant, visible presence, their faces grim, their eyes hard and watchful. I was no longer confined to the library and my own wing. I was a fixture in Dmitri's office, a silent, observant presence at his war councils. I sat at the long, polished table with his sovetniki, The hard, older men who had once looked at me with such cold, dismissive contempt. They still looked at me with suspicion, but it was now mixed with a new, grudging respect. I was the one who had seen the historical pattern, the one who had predicted the Chekhov's strategy. I had earned my place at the table. The war was a brutal, bloody, and utterly terrifying thing. But in the heart of the chaos, in the crucible of shared danger, a strange, twisted, and undeniable intimacy began to grow between Dmitri and me. We were two soldiers in a foxhole, two survivors on a lifeboat, bound together by a common enemy and a shared, desperate will to survive. The final, devastating move in the Chekhov's gambit was not an attack on Dmitri's business or his men. It was an attack on me. It was a quiet, insidious thing. A package arrived at the mansion, a simple brown cardboard box addressed to me. It was intercepted by security, of course, scanned, x-rayed, and declared safe. It was delivered to my room by a grim-faced guard. Inside was a single object, a small, worn, leather-bound copy of Alice in Wonderland. My copy. The one my mother had read to me 1,000 times as a child. Its pages soft and thin with age, its margins filled with her delicate, spidery script. Tucked inside the pages was a single, stark white photograph. It was a picture of the front of my old apartment building in Boston, taken from across the street. There was a date stamp in the corner. It was from the day before. The message was clear, unambiguous, and utterly terrifying. We know who you were. We know where you came from. We can reach across the world and touch the things you love. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A cold, hard, and utterly unfamiliar calm settled over me. I walked to Dmitri's office, the book in my hand, and I placed it on his desk. He looked at it, then at me. His face a mask of stone, but I saw it. The raw, murderous fury that blazed in the depths of his cold, pale eyes. He did not speak. He simply rose from his chair, came to stand in front of me, and he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing. A silent, violent promise of protection. He held me for a long, silent moment, his face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own. "They will not touch you," he whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing against my ear. "I will burn their world to the ground." That night, the fragile, unspoken truce between us was shattered. The shared danger, the constant, simmering tension, the raw, undeniable intimacy of our strange, twisted partnership, it all culminated in a single, explosive, and utterly inevitable event. He came to my room, a dark, silent figure in the moonlit darkness. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air was thick with a raw, desperate, and undeniable need. It was not a gentle, tender coming together. It was a collision, a violent, possessive, and utterly devastating claiming. It was a raw, brutal, and beautiful thing. A desperate, frantic attempt to find a moment of life in the heart of a world of death, in the aftermath. As we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the sound of our ragged breaths the only sound in the silent room. He turned to me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim light. "You are mine, Anya," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive thing. "You are mine to protect. You are mine to keep. You are mine." And as I looked into the eyes of this cold, brutal, and beautiful monster, This king of a dark and violent world, this man who was my husband, my jailer, my protector. I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that he was right, I was his, and in the heart of the war, in the crucible of blood and fear, I had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered. Our truce was no longer one of strategy. It was a truce of the soul, a dark and binding pact sealed in blood and desire. The Devil's Physician, Part 9, The Devil's Due. We were no longer just lovers, bound by a dark and desperate passion. We were partners, a dangerous, volatile alliance forged in the crucible of betrayal, and a love that defied all logic. The final confrontation was no longer just Kaido's war for vengeance. It was ours. Kenji Tanaka, the ghost of Kaido's past, the architect of his pain, was no longer a phantom. He was a target. And I was the weapon that would deliver the killing blow. The weeks that followed my pledge were a study in a new kind of intensity. The penthouse at the Azure Palace transformed from a gilded cage into a meticulously organized training ground, a war room for a two-person army. The air was no longer thick with a simmering, unspoken tension, but with the sharp, clean, and utterly focused energy of a shared, deadly purpose. My education was twofold. By day, I was a student of espionage. Kaido and his team of silent, efficient professionals, led by the ever-present Mr. Chen, drilled me in the art of subterfuge. I learned to lie with a placid, unreadable expression, my heart rate as steady as a metronome. I learned to spot surveillance, to detect the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of a tale. I learned to handle microelectronics, to plant a listening device with a touch as light and as steady as a surgeon's hand. By night, my education was more primal. Kaido himself was my instructor. He took me to the mansion's state-of-the-art gym, a cold, sterile room of steel and glass, and he taught me how to fight. He was not a gentle teacher. He was a brutal, exacting, and terrifyingly effective one. He taught me how to use my body not as a thing of beauty, but as a weapon. He taught me the brutal poetry of leverage and momentum, the cold, hard science of anatomy. He showed me the precise, delicate points on a man's body where a small, well-placed blow could cause a world of pain. Our training sessions were a strange, twisted, and utterly intoxicating form of intimacy. His body would be pressed against mine, his hands guiding my movements, his voice a low, rough murmur in my ear. A constant stream of cold, clinical instruction. He was teaching me to survive. And, in the process, he was branding me, marking me as his. These moments were a violent, intimate dance of two predators, a strange, dark, and beautiful form of lovemaking. His fear for my safety was a palpable thing, a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of his cold, controlled demeanor. It clashed with his ruthless, unyielding need to win this war, to finally, irrevocably, put the ghosts of his past to rest. "You do not have to do this, Evelyn," he said one night, his voice a low, rough thing as we stood in the center of the gym, our bodies slick with sweat, the air thick with the scent of our shared exertion. "Yes," I said, my own voice a cool, steady counterpoint to the wild, frantic beating of my heart. "I do." The plan was a masterpiece of audacious, intricate, and utterly ruthless design. Kenji Tanaka, in a brazen display of his feigned legitimacy, was hosting an exclusive, invitation-only International Medical Technology Summit in Hong Kong. It was a celebration of his legitimate empire, a gathering of the world's most brilliant minds in the field of biotechnology. It was the perfect stage. I would be the Trojan horse, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the brilliant, promising surgeon who had vanished from the Hong Kong medical scene after a traumatic, nervous breakdown, would resurface. I would be a woman on the mend, a fragile, beautiful, and utterly brilliant mind looking for a new, less stressful path. I would be looking for a position in the world of medical research. I would be looking for a man like Kenji Tanaka. The day of my departure was a study in controlled, almost unbearable tension. Kaido stood before me in the grand, echoing foyer of the penthouse, a dark, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored black suit. He did not speak. He simply reached out and handed me a small, heavy object. It was a pen, a simple, elegant, and impossibly expensive fountain pen. "It is more than a pen," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He showed me the mechanism, a small, almost invisible button on the side. "It is a fail-safe, a last resort. If you are compromised, if you are in danger, you cannot escape. You will press this button. It will send a signal, and I will come for you." He paused, his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, holding mine. "I will burn the city to the ground to get to you." He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, deep, and utterly desperate kiss that was a prayer, a promise, and a goodbye. "Come back to me, Aishiteru," he whispered, the Japanese word for "I love you," a raw, broken, and utterly beautiful thing against my lips. "Always," I promised. The return to Hong Kong was a surreal, disorienting experience. I was a ghost, returning to a life that was no longer mine. I checked into a suite at the Mandarin Oriental, a different kind of gilded cage, and I began the slow, meticulous process of resurrecting Dr. Evelyn Reed. I contacted a few old colleagues, my voice a carefully calibrated mixture of fragility and a new, hard-won resolve. I told them a story, a beautiful, tragic, and utterly convincing lie about a breakdown. A retreat to a private clinic in Switzerland, a slow, painful, but ultimately successful recovery. I was a woman who had been to the brink and back, a woman who is now looking for a new, quieter, and more meaningful path. The performance was flawless. I was a surgeon, after all. I knew how to project an aura of calm, confident competence, even when my own heart was a frantic, terrified drum against my ribs. The first contact was at the summit itself. The Hong Kong Convention and Exhibition Center was a glittering, sterile world of glass and steel, a world of polite, ambitious people and carefully constructed lies. It was a world that was not so different from Kaido's. I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity. It was just better dressed. I saw him from across the crowded, cavernous hall, Kenji Tanaka. He was not the brutish, obvious monster I had imagined. He was a man of a quiet, understated, and utterly captivating charm. He was in his late 60s, his hair a distinguished, silver gray, his face a mask of a kind, scholarly benevolence. He was dressed in a simple, elegant, and impossibly expensive suit, his movements the fluid, confident motions of a man who was used to being the center of any room he entered. He was a different kind of monster, a more subtle, more insidious, and far more dangerous one. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a devil in a bespoke suit. I played my part. I was the brilliant, beautiful, and slightly broken Dr. Reed. I moved through the crowd with a quiet, almost shy grace, my eyes holding a hint of a deep, tragic sadness that I knew he would find irresistible. Our meeting was a carefully orchestrated accident, a dropped portfolio, a shared, polite laugh, a moment of a seemingly fated connection. He was, as I had known he would be, utterly captivated. He was a collector of beautiful, rare, and valuable things, and I, with my brilliant mind, my tragic past, and my beautiful, sad eyes, was a prize he was determined to acquire. The chess match began. The interview was in his private office, a vast minimalist space on the top floor of his corporate headquarters, a room that was a testament to his immense wealth and his cold, clinical, and utterly ruthless soul. It was a tense, psychological duel, a game of 1,000 subtle, unspoken moves. He probed my past, my motivations, my weaknesses. I fed him the story Kaito and I had so meticulously crafted, a beautiful, tragic, and utterly convincing lie. He offered me a position, not just a job, but a place at his side, a key role in his most ambitious, most secret, and most profitable research project. It was a test, I knew, an invitation into the heart of his dark kingdom. The final act was to take place at his private estate, a sprawling, heavily guarded fortress on a secluded island off the coast of Hong Kong. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and absolute, terrifying isolation. It was the heart of the lion's den. The night of my visit, the air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of a storm about to break. I was a guest in his home, a beautiful, fragile, and utterly trusted confidant. And I was a spy, a soldier, a queen on a mission to destroy him. The house was a masterpiece of Japanese minimalist design, a world of paper screens, polished wood, and the quiet, contemplative beauty of a Zen garden. It was a world that was a mockery of the home Kaito had lost, a beautiful, elegant, and utterly profane lie. My objective was simple and almost impossible. I had to access his private study, a room that was said to be as impenetrable as a bank vault, and I had to plant a device, a small, sophisticated piece of technology that would give Kaito's hacker access to his entire digital empire. I had a window of 30 minutes. During a formal dinner party he was hosting for his most trusted investors. It was a high-stakes, split-second gambit, a single, desperate move in a game where the cost of failure was my life. The dinner was an exercise in exquisite, almost unbearable tension. I sat at Kenji's right hand, a place of honor, a symbol of his favor. I smiled, I laughed. I played the part of the brilliant, beautiful, and utterly captivated Dr. Reed. And all the while, my heart was a frantic, terrified drum against my ribs, the seconds ticking away like a bomb. I made my move, a feigned headache, a quiet retreat to my guest suite, a silent ghost-like journey through the dark, quiet corridors of his home. I was a shadow, a whisper, a creature of the night. The study was as he had described it, a fortress. The lock was a complex, biometric system. But Kaito had prepared me. I had a device, a small, sophisticated piece of technology that would bypass it. I had one chance. My hands, the hands of a surgeon, were steady. My mind was a cold, clear, an analytical machine. I worked in the darkness. The only sound the soft, almost imperceptible click of the device as it did its work. And then, the lock disengaged with a soft, almost gentle snick. I was in. The study was a world of shadows and secrets, the air thick with the scent of old paper, of power, of a deep, ancient, and utterly consuming evil. I moved to his desk, my hands a blur of motion, my heart a frantic, wild drum. I found the port. I planted the device. It was done. And then, the lights came on. He was standing in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure, his face a mask of a cold, polite, and utterly terrifying curiosity. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He was amused. "You are a remarkable woman, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, calm, and utterly final thing, "a truly remarkable woman. It is a pity, a great pity, that you chose the wrong side." The game was over. The trap had been a trap. He had known all along. The final confrontation was not a battle of wits. It was a battle of wills. He did not call his guards. He simply walked toward me, his face a mask of a cold, reptilian cunning. "He sent you to kill me, didn't he?" he asked, his voice a soft, conversational thing. My nephew, my poor, broken, and utterly predictable nephew. He was in front of me now, so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of his expensive cologne, the cold, dead scent of his soul. "He should have sent a monster," he said, his voice a low, almost gentle murmur, "not a beautiful, broken bird." He reached for me then, his hand surprisingly strong, his movement surprisingly fast. But I was ready. Kaido had prepared me. The fight was not a brawl. It was a dissection. I used the self-defense he had taught me, the cold, clinical, and utterly brutal knowledge of human anatomy that was my true weapon. I did not fight him with strength. I fought him with precision. A sharp, targeted blow to his throat. A precise, disabling strike to his knee. He was a strong man, but he was just a man. And I was a surgeon. He fell to the floor, a broken, gasping, and utterly defeated thing. And then, the world exploded. The sound of the first explosion was a deafening, earth-shattering roar that shook the very foundations of the house. The windows shattered inward. The lights went out. The air was thick with the smell of explosives and the dust of pulverized plaster. Kaido had kept his promise. He had come for me. In the chaos, in the darkness, in the heart of the firestorm, I stood over the broken, defeated form of the man who had destroyed Kaido's life, and in my hand was the pen, the failsafe, the last resort. I did not press the button. I did not need to. The war was over, and I had won. The Devil's Physician, Part 10. The Unmasked King. The aftermath of the explosion was a symphony of chaos. The serene, minimalist beauty of Kenji Tanaka's island fortress was a ruin of shattered glass, splintered wood, and the acrid, choking smell of cordite. In the heart of the destruction, in the silent, dust-filled ruin of his impenetrable study, I stood over the broken, defeated form of the man who had been the ghost in Kaido's past, the architect of his pain. The world outside was a cacophony of distant sirens and the frantic, crackling roar of the fires that were beginning to consume the house. But in the study, the silence was absolute, a pocket of stillness in the heart of the storm. Kenji Tanaka was not dead. He was a broken, gasping, and utterly defeated thing, his body a testament to the brutal, clinical precision of the lessons Kaido had taught me. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vengeance. I felt a strange, cold, and utterly profound sense of finality. The ghost had been unmasked. The war was over. And then, he came. He moved through the chaos of the burning house like a phantom, a dark, avenging angel in a world of fire and ash. He was not a part of the chaos. He was its master. He appeared in the shattered doorway of the study, a dark, imposing figure against the flickering, demonic light of the flames. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, were a maelstrom of 100 unreadable emotions. He did not look at the broken man on the floor. He looked only at me. His gaze swept over me, a frantic, desperate search for injury, for a single, misplaced drop of blood, a single tear in the fabric of my dress. "Evelyn," he said, my name a raw, ragged thing on his tongue. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, and he was in front of me, his hands framing my face, his touch a cage of terrifying gentleness. He was real. He was here. He had kept his promise. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough thing, stripped of its usual melodic cadence. "No," I whispered, my own voice a shaky, trembling thing, a sound, a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated relief, tore from his throat, and then he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing, a silent, violent promise that he would never let me go again. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own. He broke the embrace and looked down at the broken, whimpering form of his uncle. A look of a cold, pure, and utterly terrifying hatred passed through his eyes, a darkness so profound it seemed to suck the very light from the room. He did not kill him. He simply looked at me, a silent, unspoken question in his eyes. This was not his justice to claim. It was ours. And in that moment, in the heart of the firestorm, I knew that a quick, clean death was too easy a fate for the man who had orchestrated so much pain. It was too merciful. I was a doctor. I knew the intricate, beautiful, and brutal mechanics of the human body. I knew that there were fates far worse than death. "No," I said, my voice a quiet, steady, and utterly unforgiving thing. "He doesn't get to die. Not yet." The flight back to Macau was a silent, surreal journey through a sky the color of bruises. We were 2 ghosts, returning from a war that had been waged in the shadows for a lifetime. Kaito did not speak. He simply held my hand, his fingers, strong and calloused and stained with the ink of his violent life, laced through my own. His touch was a silent, constant, and utterly grounding presence. Kenji Tanaka did not die. He was flown to a private, secure medical facility, a place that did not exist on any map. A place where the best doctors money could buy worked for the devil himself. I did not operate. I supervised. I gave the orders. I designed the protocol. It was a masterpiece of medical science and of a cold, brutal, and utterly personal form of justice. We did not just save his life. We rebuilt it. We trapped him in it. He would live, but he would not be alive. He would be a prisoner in his own broken body, his brilliant, evil mind a ghost in a machine that no longer obeyed his commands. It was a living death, a state of utter powerlessness that would be a constant, living monument to Kaito's victory. It was a fate far more cruel and far more fitting than a simple bullet. The Azure Palace, when we returned, was different. The air was no longer thick with the simmering, unspoken tension of a kingdom at war. It was a kingdom at peace, a dark, brutal, and utterly absolute peace. The staff, who had once looked at me with a mixture of fear and a grudging respect, now looked at me with something else entirely. Awe. I was no longer just the Pakan's doctor, his lover, his queen. I was the woman who had walked into the heart of the enemy's fortress and had burned it to the ground. I was a legend, a ghost story, a dark, beautiful, and utterly terrifying queen in my own right. Our life settled into a new, strange, and beautiful rhythm. The war was over, but our life was not one of peace, not in any conventional sense. It was a life of power, of control, of a shared, dark, and utterly consuming purpose. We were the unmasked king and his queen, and Macau was our kingdom. The final, absolute, and utter surrender came on a quiet Tuesday night. A month after our return from Hong Kong, the city of Macau spread out beneath us, a glittering, indifferent carpet of diamonds. We were in the penthouse, in the vast, silent living area, a fire roaring in the hearth, a bottle of expensive Japanese whiskey on the table between us. Kaito had been silent for a long time, his masked face turned toward the city, his eyes, those stormy, gray-green eyes, holding a new, strange, and almost peaceful light. He turned to me then, and he did something I had never seen him do before. He reached up, his hand, the perfect, unscarred one, and he slowly, deliberately, unfastened the clasps of his mask. He did not do it in a moment of weakness, of delirium, of pain. He did it in a moment of a quiet, profound, and utter strength. It was not a surrender. It was a gift, an offering, an act of a trust so absolute, so profound. It stole the breath from my lungs. He removed the mask and let it fall to the floor with a soft, almost gentle clatter, and he showed me his face, the real one, the one I had seen only in the heart of a fevered nightmare, the ruin, the devastation, the beautiful, brutal, and utterly heartbreaking testament to his pain. He did not speak. He simply stood before me, unmasked, unguarded, and utterly vulnerable, and he waited. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply rose from my chair and went to him. I reached up, my hands, the hands of a surgeon, and I touched his face. I traced the lines of his scars, the puckered, melted tissue, the ruined landscape of his past. My touch was not one of pity. It was one of acceptance, of understanding, of a love so profound, so absolute, it transcended the boundaries of beauty and monstrosity. "You are beautiful," I whispered, my voice a raw, honest, and utterly true thing in the quiet of the room. A single, perfect tear, a thing of a shocking, beautiful, and utterly devastating clarity, escaped from his eye and traced a path through the ruined landscape of his face. He leaned in and kissed me then, a slow, deep, and utterly reverent kiss that was not a taking, but a giving. A final, absolute, and utter surrender in the aftermath. As we stood by the window, the city of Macau glittering at our feet, he turned to me, his unmasked, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly beautiful face illuminated by the cold, distant light of the stars. "My father's research," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "It was not lost in the fire. My uncle stole it, and now it is mine." He looked at me then, his eyes, those stormy gray-green eyes, holding a new, strange, and utterly terrifying question. "What do we do with it?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us, a question of a power so vast, so absolute. It was almost a form of godhood, the power to heal, to cure, to rewrite the very code of life. I looked at the man before me, at the monster, the killer, the king I had fallen in love with. I looked at the city glittering at our feet, a world of beautiful, corrupt, and utterly human souls. We heal the world, Kaito, I said, my voice a quiet, steady, and utterly final thing, one monster at a time. A slow, sad, and utterly beautiful smile touched his lips. It was the first true smile I had ever seen on his face, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. We were not a story of redemption. We were not a story of light conquering darkness. We were a story of two dark, broken souls who had found a perfect, albeit twisted, harmony in the shadows. We were the devil and his doctor, the unmasked king and his queen, and our reign, our beautiful, brutal, and utterly consuming reign, had just begun.